If it's Friday, it's official. Well, almost. The Harris campaign says the vice president has clinched enough delegates during a virtual roll call to officially win the Democratic nomination, as Harris inches closer to choosing a running mate while hoping to maintain momentum with voters and donors. Plus, home at last, an emotional and historic moment as President Biden and Vice President Harris welcome home 3 Americans freed from Russian prisons as they reunite with their loved ones following that massive multi-nation prisoner swap. And the Pentagon prepares to bolster U.S. forces in the Middle East as the head of Hezbollah vows vengeance against Israel, warning that the conflict has entered a new phase after the killings of multiple top leaders in Hamas and Hezbollah. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake in Washington, where after a whirlwind couple of weeks, the Democratic National Committee and the Harris campaign say Vice President Harris will be the Democratic nominee after officially securing the required number of delegates to clinch the nomination during a virtual roll call today. In a live-streamed campaign event, which suffered from multiple technical glitches in the lead-up to Harris's appearance, Harris addressed supporters, calling herself for the first time her party's presumptive nominee.
I am honored to be the presumptive Democratic nominee for President of the United States. Of course, I will officially accept your nomination next week once the virtual voting period is closed. But already I'm happy to know that we have enough delegates to secure the nomination. And later this month, we will gather in Chicago, united as one party, where we're going to have an opportunity to celebrate this historic moment together.
At the same time, Harris is finalizing her choice for her running mate and preparing to announce it any day. Sources tell NBC News that the vice president plans to meet with the top contenders in person in the next 72 hours. Once the running mate is picked, the new Democratic ticket will immediately hit the road for a barnstorm of the battleground states, starting with a Tuesday evening rally in Philadelphia. It all comes as Harris's team is touting what it says is a massive $310 million fundraising haul in July. That's more than double the nearly $139 million the Trump team says it raised. Polls now show disillusioned Democrats appearing re-energized by their new candidate, with the Harris campaign gaining momentum in key battleground states. It is a stunning turn of events for the party following that disastrous debate performance from President Biden in late June. Earlier today, Trump was asked whether he regretted agreeing to that debate, given how Democrats have used it to regroup and rebound.
Do you regret doing the debate when you did the debate? It gave the Democrats an opportunity to swap him out and put her in. Such an early debate.
They wanted a debate. If I didn't do the debate, they'd say, oh, Trump's, not doing the debate. That's the same thing they'll say now. I mean, right now I say, why should I do a debate? I'm leading in the polls. And everybody knows her. Everybody knows me.
Joining me now from the White House is somebody else everybody knows. It's NBC's Monica Alba. Monica, we mentioned Harris has won the delegates she needs to secure the nomination. What, if anything, does the campaign change about this now? What does this change for the campaign? And what can we expect from the convention now later this month?
It doesn't functionally change anything, Garrett, except it gives them another data point in this build of momentum that they are hoping to continue and stretch into this running mate selection process and then on to the actual Democratic National Convention. This was something that they were going to do, whether it was President Joe Biden at the top of the ticket or now in this new case, Vice President Harris. And it's something they had to really get done by this Ohio ballot deadline that's supposed to take place on August 7th. So it will formally conclude on Monday night. But essentially her campaign and the DNC are both saying she's amassed enough delegates to cross that threshold, but she will ceremonially receive and recognize that actual nomination when she's in Chicago at the DNC. So this is more of a formality, but it gives them another moment to fundraise. It gives them another moment to try to really talk about how this campaign is only 2 weeks old, but they will argue they've already done so much.
And Monica, part of the path forward obviously includes sharing who her running mate will be. We don't have any reason to think that decision has been made yet. We know some of these candidates have now reshuffled their weekend plans to come meet with Harris. What do we know about what the contenders are doing over the next couple days, how this decision will come together?
Normally, you would have months to have these kinds of meetings, and they wouldn't all have to maybe take place over one weekend in this compressed timeline. But of course, that is what Vice President Harris now needs to do. Today, she didn't really have much on her public schedule except for those remarks she made by phone with the virtual roll call. This weekend, she's supposed to be at the Naval Observatory. So we know that there will be some meetings with some of those governors you had up on the screen, potentially Senator Mark Kelly, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. And these are people that, of course, Vice President Harris has been in touch with. She's been on the trail with some of them. She has interacted with them. But this is an opportunity for her to actually sit down, maybe have a little bit more of a conversation that's a little lighter about how do we interact? Are we two people who could work together, and kind of get that assessment? And we think that will be wrapped up by the weekend, and then maybe Monday a decision could be finalized, and they would announce that, as we indicated, before the Tuesday evening rally where that running mate is set to appear.
And Monica, we talked a little bit this time yesterday about the idea that Harris has been at center stage, not just on the campaign trail, but within the administration since taking over as the nominee. What can you tell us about this effort by the White House to credit her as much as possible for the governing work that's going on between now and November?
And there are two really clear foreign policy examples of just that in the last 2 weeks. And last week, it was centered on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he was visiting and he had that joint address to Congress. He had his own bilateral meeting with Vice President Harris that took on new meaning and significance because he was the first world leader to sit down with her after she had now become the de facto Democratic nominee at that time. And then this week, they are trying to amplify her limited role, but a role that she still played in having some meetings with the German Chancellor and the Slovenian Prime Minister back in February of this year in terms of trying to nail down this massive prisoner exchange that did come to fruition yesterday. But they're also trying to put this in the context of Vice President Harris trying to map out her own foreign policy perspective, which is not something that she is known for as much as some of her other work and experience. So that's something they're going to try to beef up and continue to highlight, I think, in these next few weeks. And they will use any example like the ones I just mentioned to continue to do that. Garrett.
All right, good stuff. Good reporting. Monica Alba, thank you for that. I want to bring in our panel now. Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Politico. Eugene Robinson, columnist at The Washington Post and an NBC News political analyst. And Sarah Fagan, Republican strategist and former White House political director under George W. Bush. She is also an NBC News contributor. Nick, I'll start with you. Our colleague Chuck Todd suggested that given the confines of the calendar, Kamala Harris could really stretch this VP selection process out for maximum political advantage. And your viewpoint, has she done so? We've not seen these contenders on the trail with her.
Well, as we just heard, she has this actually relatively short timeline in which to pick a nominee because of that Ohio deadline. It's been reported that she has all these events in the next couple weeks where she's going to be going around the country with a vice presidential nominee, and in theory, you would have picked one by then. We had reported that one of her first events was going to be in Philadelphia. The Harris campaign said not to read too much into that location. Wink, wink. But you know, I think what we're seeing here is the Harris campaign using this moment, all of the attention on the vice presidential sweepstakes, so to speak, to generate energy and attention for the campaign and a lot of earned media, so to speak, that they might not otherwise have gotten. So
yeah, look, there are direct flights to Philadelphia from just about anywhere these folks are from, so anything's possible.
And she's got rallies lined up in all the swing states.
That's right. So, Eugene, but we are seeing a lot of energy from within the party, including from these other kind of big players on the Democratic ticket that we were not seeing for Joe Biden. I mean, how much has this Veep stakes provided an opportunity to give a boost to the nominee here? Yeah, I mean,
first of all, it has made sort of marquee names of all of the Democratic bench, right? That's right? When the Democrats kept saying we have this great bench that a lot of people really didn't know except people in that state. Well, now everybody knows more about Mark Kelly, more about Josh Shapiro, more about Gretchen Whitmer. And look, she's done a very good job of sucking all the oxygen out of the air, right? And dominating news cycle after news cycle after news cycle. And so as long as she can keep playing offense like that, I think she'll keep doing it.
If you're picking now, who should she pick?
Oh, boy.
Come on.
You know.
Lightning round.
So, look, Philadelphia, you got to say Shapiro, but maybe, you know, I think Bashir has a lot to recommend him. Kelly, you could make the border argument. You know,
this is a good problem to have.
It's a great problem to have. We think, right? I mean, let's be honest. There's some peril in this, right? Because you're making a very quick decision that will have long-lasting ramifications, and you have foreshorten the vetting process. Now, these people have been vetted in statewide elections, most of them, so it's not like they're total unknowns. Yet the national vetting, the national press, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah, Sarah Fagan, you've got experience with that. You know the national process of this is completely different. What do you make? There's this process going on right now, too, to define Kamala Harris, right? There's a race between Donald Trump and his team and Harris's team to define her. How can she use this pick to define herself going forward? What if, if you're her, do you want this pick to say about you as a candidate, as perhaps a future president?
Well, the prudent thing politically for her is to go to the middle. I mean, if you sort of think about the contours of this race, there's a huge piece of the electorate that didn't want Biden and didn't want Trump. And so by definition, she's getting a lot of energy because she's not named either of those. And so she, there's like this new renewed energy about, for a lot of voters. Now, I think we can't read too much into any of this until about 2 weeks after the Democratic convention. This race is going to have to sort of settle out. She's got the momentum. Trump had it 2 weeks ago. It could easily volley back to Trump.
Nobody's voting in August.
Nobody's voting in August. But, to go back to your question, she is to the left of Joe Biden politically. At least if you look at her history and her statements, that would lead you to believe that. The prudent thing for her to do is to go to the middle, to pick a more centrist Democratic governor. It appears like that's what she's going to do, could be senator. And, that would say something to those people who are giving her a first look. Maybe she's not as liberal as I might think. Maybe she's different than, what I am seeing out of these protests and rallies on Israel and Palestine. And that would be smart politically for her.
Did Trump make the wrong decision? He certainly didn't moderate himself with his pick. He didn't pick somebody closer to the middle than he.
I don't think he made the wrong decision. I think he didn't make the most astute political decision, is how I would say it. There's
very diplomatic of you.
Well, no, but there's a lot of factors that go into this. Do you want someone who is going to be the best person to govern the country should something happen to you? Do you want somebody who's going to carry your legacy? Do you want somebody who's going to give you a political edge? It's great when you can find somebody that does all three. It's hard to do that. And so these candidates for office make trade-offs. And so I don't think he made it at all a wrong decision. The political decision for him, perhaps he would have made a different one had he been making his choice now. It's like, what do you say to those Bush Republicans who are uneasy with you? That wasn't J.D. Vance. Now, again, a lot of those people are going to vote for this ticket because they're going to be more aligned politically. But a more kind of mainstream Republican, perhaps, would have spoken to that. So there's always trade-offs in these things.
Somewhere on Earth, too, we'll get an answer to that question. Nick, on the timing part of this, there's a lot of time left in the sense that nobody votes in August, but there's not like a ton of time left. We're 95 days out until Election Day. If you're the Harris campaign, how do you maintain this momentum that they've been able to generate, some of it organically, some of it kind of by intent, over the next several weeks, several months?
Well, that is the main question for the Harris campaign right now. We've seen an outpouring of energy on the Democratic side, all the record-breaking Zooms for white women for Kamala, the Asian groups, the Latinos for Kamala, fundraisers and whatnot. But the question is whether or not they can maintain that for those remaining 3 months. There's still a swath of the electorate who doesn't really know who the vice president is and certainly will not have necessarily heard of any of the half dozen people she's thinking of as her vice presidential nominee. And so that's going to take a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort for Democrats to make their case.
Well, if maintaining the momentum costs money, she doesn't have a shortage of that.
There is that. And, as we saw, as I mentioned with Monica, she's getting a boost from the White House, which is elevating her profile.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you make of their efforts to give her some of the power of incumbency without losing that new car smell, right?
You notice that in almost every release, every statement that comes out of the White House these days. You see that sort of aura of, it's always...
Suddenly she's in every meeting.
She's in every meeting. Everything is Biden-Harris. Not that it wasn't mostly before, but it really is now. And no, they're giving her a boost, right? This is the power of incumbency. Yeah. And she is an incumbent vice president.
Sarah, I've noticed that Trump has been kind of disappeared in a lot of ways since the convention. Obviously, he's had some news-making moments, but he's not on the trail significantly this week. He has basically nothing between Saturday and next Friday. He's not going to appear on the trail as far as we know. What do you make of the less is more strategy from Trump? It made sense when Joe Biden was sinking, but if your opponent has all this momentum, does he need to be trying to change the conversation right now?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it's going to be all the Democrats this week, assuming the VP announcement is made. And then there's the online convention, and then there's the convention. So, part of this is, even though there's only 95, 94 days left, there's a long time. And having a thoughtful cadence for a challenger makes sense to me. Now, I don't know what his vacation schedule is. There could be other factors going on in here, but I imagine you're going to see him on the trail a lot. And just because he's not this week doesn't mean much.
But doesn't it drive him crazy not to have the spotlight on him every day? Isn't that why he went crazy at NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, on Wednesday? Because he wanted the attention. He wanted to go on offense. He wanted to, let's bring up race and let's get into a mud wrestling thing.
But to that end, I want to show you a tweet from Simone Biles overnight last night talking about her black job winning Olympic gold medals. I think we can put that up on screen. If that's the cultural zeitgeist that Donald Trump gets by going off at NABJ, that is not how you want your political messaging to be entering the conversation.
You don't want that to be your messaging, and you definitely don't want to be running against Simone Biles.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. Dangerous. I don't know how she does in the swing states, but I think she's
goat all over the place.
Across the country. All right, guys, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for starting us off today. We had a lot of ground to cover. Nick, Sarah, and Eugene, I appreciate you all coming in. And meanwhile, it has been a tough day on Wall Street as the Dow fell more than 600 points after a July jobs report showed weaker than expected growth in the labor market. The economy added 114,000 new jobs last month. That is the smallest one-month gain since December of 2020, when, as you may recall, we were in the midst of a global pandemic. Now, the unemployment rate also ticked up to 4.3%. In a statement today, President Biden touted his and Vice President Harris's overall record on job creation during their term, clearly trying to share some credit with his party's new presumptive nominee. CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman joins me now. Steve, should there be reason for concern here that perhaps the Fed has waited too long to cut interest rates and the soft landing could turn into something else?
I think so. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but there's renewed concern today, and I think the market is expressing that, both relative to the valuations. Remember, it had been very, very high for quite some time. And now we're in a place where, we've been cruising along. Every month we were surprising to the upside on jobs, and it's gradually been coming down. We were north of 200,000. All of that said, I think it's okay to take a deep breath here and say, A, it's 1 month's report. B, 114,000 was the old good enough run rate that we used to have before. So I'm not sure that all of this, what do you want to call it, Sturm and drag is really appropriate at this moment.
I appreciate a little German on the afternoon broadcast today. The market does seem to be pricing in a rate cut now in September. Is that inevitable at this point, do you think?
I think it's inevitable, but what's even more interesting, first of all, it's actually pricing in what you would call 2 rate cuts or a half a percentage point. Before it was just pricing in 25, and now it's pricing in a very aggressive Federal Reserve in terms of bringing down rates through the rest of this year. Almost 200 basis points over the course of the next, or 2 percentage points over the course of the next 12 months would really bring down interest rates quite a bit. And you can see it, by the way, the mortgage rate has fallen. It had been up north of 7%, and now today we got a read of it's still high, but it's lower at 6.4%.
Yeah, well, good news for people who want to refinance, especially if you bought at a higher interest rate. Should we be more concerned right now about inflation or the possibility of recession? I sort of thought we'd put the talk of recession behind us, but perhaps not.
Well, we had, and one of the notable changes in the Federal Reserve's policy statement this Wednesday was it said, look, previously they said we're really highly concerned about inflation. This week they said, hey, the risks to both sides are much more balanced than they were before. So the Fed should be at this place, if you think about it, on a fence where it could fall either way. It should really be in this place where it's very worried about both sides of the mandate, and then it has policy right. But right now, because there has been a few other data points that have suggested weakness in the manufacturing sector and some other parts of the economy, that there is an increased risk of recession. But just to be clear, we went into this quarter with pretty good estimates of growth being above potential. We've done about 2% over the first half, which is about the economy's supposed potential here. So we were doing okay. What I would do at this point is watch the consumer and to see whether or not consumers reduce their spending. That will ultimately determine the fate of the U.S. economy.
We'll be watching closely, Stephen. I know you will be too. Thank you very much for that reporting.
Pleasure.
Coming up, Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan speak out for the first time since being released from Russian detention. I'll talk to a former ambassador to Ukraine about last night's emotional homecoming and what the historic prisoner deal could say about Putin's grip on power and his war against Kyiv. Plus, making moves, the Pentagon is preparing to bolster U.S. and Israeli forces in the Middle East amid rising fears that the Israel-Hezbollah tensions could escalate into an all-out war. We have the latest developments. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. 3 American families have been reunited after that historic prisoner swap involving the U.S., Russia, and multiple other countries. This was the emotional scene last night as their plane touched down on U.S. soil with the president and vice president welcoming those Americans home. Marine veteran Paul Whelan was the first to step off that plane, greeted by cheers, briefly speaking with Biden and Harris, shaking their hands. Minutes later, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich stepped onto the tarmac. You can see the wide grin on his face before walking over to his family, embracing his mom. Finally, journalist Alshu Kurmasheva running over to her family, hugging her husband, her 2 daughters for the first time in almost a year. Standing on the tarmac, President Biden spoke about bringing those Americans back home.
It feels wonderful. Long time in coming. I was absolutely convinced we could get it done. And then when I said, alliances make a difference. Other leaders trust you, you trust them, you get things done. And that's how this got done. A lot of help.
Those 3 Americans are now in San Antonio, Texas, where they're receiving medical and post-isolation support. Overnight, Gershkovich and Whelan spoke briefly to reporters about their homecoming.
It was great to get on that bus today and see a lot of, not just Americans and Germans, but Russian political prisoners. But I just spent a month in prison in Yekaterinburg, where there's a whole, basically everybody I sat with is a political prisoner. Today was a really touching moment to see all of them, and it would be, I think to see if we could potentially do something about them as well.
Getting off the plane, seeing the president, the vice president, that was nice. It was a good homecoming. So looking forward to seeing my family down here and just recuperating from 5 years, 7 months, and 5 days of just absolute nonsense by the Russian government.
Incredible. Joining me now is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and vice president for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador, this is obviously a huge day for these families, but we also gave up what the Kremlin now acknowledges is an FSB operative to make this trade. As a diplomat, how do you weigh those concerns and make these deals?
It's real hard. It's real hard. And people above diplomats grade make these decisions. Yeah, you're letting loose an assassin, FSB, KGB assassin, and letting him out of prison. He was in jail for life for assassinating a Chechen in Berlin, broad daylight. The Germans really didn't want to do that. That was part of the real problem getting this deal done.
What's the blowback like in Germany? I mean, what do they gain out of this, and what are the politics going to be like there?
They get some people back. There are some Germans that came out of Russian jails, so that's good. They also clearly worked with the Americans, and the chancellor and the president clearly had something going to make that work. But I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's going to be difficult. That said, the balance tips toward getting the Americans out, getting the hostages out.
What does his willingness to make this deal tell us about Putin's politics? The idea of not even necessarily the Russian voter, but the importance of telling the Russian security services, I'm going to bring our people home. Why would he make this deal?
This is a great question. I think President Putin has some problems. I think he's got problems in Ukraine. I think he's not doing very well there. He's got constraints on his manpower, on the equipment, and the Ukrainians are starting to show that they've got some stuff. They got some stuff from us. They're using this equipment to push the Russians out of the Black Sea, out of the western part of the Black Sea. So the incline for the Ukrainians is measurable. Putin knows this. He can see this. He would like to find some way out of this, I bet. We, on the other hand, are not interested in making any deals after this as hostage deal. We know, and he knows that we know, to get out of this problem that he's caused in Ukraine, he can pose troops.
Well, to that end, the White House was pretty clear yesterday. They didn't see this as a sign of a thaw or of a change in relations in Russia. But should we read anything into it? I mean, you kind of touched on this. Is the position in Ukraine changing in such a way? Should we be looking for a door here to start talks? And what are the obstacles to that?
Putin should be looking for the door. Putin should find the door. He's the one who's caused this problem. He's the one that needs to get himself out of it. The Ukrainians have shown no indication. Yeah, they're tired. They've been fighting for 2.5 years. They're certainly tired. They want this war to stop, but they don't want to give up territory. They don't want to accede to what Putin is demanding. So, no, they're still fighting, and he wants a way out.
They either have received or are about to receive their first batch of these F-16s. Is that a kind of system that can change this war in some meaningful way? I feel like when we check in on the war, it's like we're fighting over the same 10 villages and have been for a very long time.
We have been over a very long time, which says something about this large Russian army not being able to move.
That's clear, yeah.
And you asked about the F-16s. Yeah, it's a capability that they will now have, the Ukrainians will now have, to shoot at Russians which are shooting at them. So that's going to be important. It's not going to change the nature of it. What may change the nature of it is long-range fires. The Ukrainians can make it hard for the Russians to stay in Crimea. That could have a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, we've ultimately, not as quickly as they wanted to, ceded to basically every Ukrainian ask for a new weapon system. Is the pressure on the Ukrainians in kind of the bigger geopolitical sense here to show some measurable progress now, given what they've received from the West?
They will, yes, but probably not for 6 months. I mean, right now they're going to be defending what they've got, the Ukrainians, and they're going to be building up what they've got 19 new brigades they're training people for and equipping. Sometime in the next 6 or 7 or 8 months, they will be moving back on the offensive.
There's an interesting new player in all of this. Ukraine has invited China's foreign minister to Kyiv. What do you make of the possibility of China serving as some kind of mediator here? How should the U.S. and the West look at that?
The Chinese are the one nation that has influence over Russia. Russia needs China. That's clearly a little brother Russia, big brother China. So the Chinese can have some influence on what the Russians do. The Chinese have already told the Russians, shut up about this nuclear stuff. And Putin has kind of responded to that. So they can have an influence.
Do they want to use that influence?
They probably want to use that influence. They've shown in other negotiations that they're in the Middle East, that they're willing to play a role. So, yes, they would like to be able to be seen to be doing something like this. And they've not stepped over the line of providing weapons to the Russians.
That's true.
Even though the Russians have asked. And the Chinese don't want to be sanctioned. So they've not gone over that line. They've provided other things. So, yes, the Chinese might be able to bring some pressure to bear on the Russians.
It'll be very interesting to watch. Ambassador Bill Taylor, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you, Garrett.
All right, turning now to the latest on the Venezuelan election. The U.S. is now basically accusing incumbent President Nicolas Maduro of trying to steal his country's presidential election. As the White House announced, it was officially recognizing the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, as the winner. Venezuela's National Electoral Authority had declared Maduro the victor on Monday, but according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the opposition party now has provided, quote, overwhelming evidence that it's Gonzalez, not Maduro, who actually received the most votes. Protests, as you might imagine, broke out across Venezuela this week as both sides doubled down on their claims of victory. American and international leaders have called on the Venezuelan Election Authority to release those detailed vote tallies. Up next, Hezbollah's warning to Israel and what's next in the Middle East after 2 high-profile assassinations of Iran-backed militants, Tehran and Beirut. A retired 4-star Army general who oversaw U.S. and coalition military operations in the region joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The Middle East remains on edge after the death of senior figures in both Hamas and Hezbollah, 2 militant groups backed by Iran, with Tehran and its allies now vowing retaliation, raising concerns that the region could be engulfed in an even wider war. During a phone conversation yesterday with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Biden reaffirmed his commitment to Israel's security against any threat posed by Iran and its proxies. And today, the Pentagon announced it's preparing to deploy additional forces to the region. While Israel has not taken responsibility for the attack on Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, his death has further complicated any chances of a ceasefire in Gaza. President Biden announced yesterday he was, quote, very concerned about the situation and reiterated the need for an agreement.
We have the basis for a ceasefire. They should move on it, and they should move on it now.
Is the chance for a ceasefire ruined after the assassination of Haniyeh?
It's not helped.
Joining me now is retired four-star General Joseph Votel. He's a former commander of U.S. Central Command and a distinguished senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. So, General, the U.S. and the Middle East now are all bracing for what form this retaliation by Iran could take. Should we expect their response to come sooner rather than later? What do we know and what should we expect, given that this is a Hamas leader killed inside Tehran?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you. Well, I think we should be paying attention to what the Iranians and what Hezbollah is saying, and what they've signaled over the last couple of days, and again today, is that there will be a response, and that it will likely be a coordinated response, meaning that it won't be just something that comes from Iran, but will likely include other components of the Iranian axis of resistance. So that could be Hezbollah, that could be Hamas, that could be other Shia militia groups in the region that could be responding. It could be the Houthis. So we should be expecting this, and they've told us that.
I mean, to that end, though, back in April, we saw how well the U.S. and Israel were able to defend against that massive wave of Iranian drones, kind of the last time we were in a similar situation. Should we expect a similar response this time around? Sort of, is that the one big punch that Iran can throw in this moment?
Well, I think that's the baseline. So as I kind of look at it, I mean, this was a pretty good exemplar of how they would likely respond. So I think that is a template. But I think it's important to appreciate that Iran has learned from that. They have gone back and looked at the lessons learned from that April strike and where they could have done better, and they will likely try to improve upon that. They will look for vulnerabilities. They will consider timing in this. They will look at the volume of fires in this. Over 300 missiles and uncrewed systems were used last time, so which were fairly effectively defeated by the Israelis and the U.S. and other partners in that coalition. So they will definitely be looking at how they maximize impact this time around.
The Pentagon said today they will be making force posture moves to bolster force protection in that special kind of military jargon. What do you expect that will look like? What kind of assets need to be moved to the region? What's not already there after nearly a year of war in that region?
Yeah, well, a lot of the forces that are in the Middle East are very transitory. They come in, they depart, just as we've seen with a number of our naval and maritime assets that have been in the region. So, first and foremost, the U.S. will be looking at how we make sure we protect our installations and diplomatic posts in the area so that they are protected. That's important to do right up front. But in addition, we'll be looking at air defense systems. We'll be looking at potentially the movement of additional fighter aircraft into the area, and of course the movement of naval resources into the area. Naval resources, of course, give us great flexibility to respond to this, and they take a little bit of time to get there. So. Yeah, I think we're likely to see those types of capabilities going into the region.
I also want to get your reaction to some of the reporting about the death of that Hamas political leader inside Tehran. The New York Times says that Israel was able to smuggle an explosive device into the complex 2 months ago. Now, Israel hasn't taken responsibility for that attack, but, somebody did it. So I guess my question to you is, what would it say about Israel's ability to penetrate inside Iran, their covert capabilities to pull off something like this?
Well, despite what happened on October 7th, Israel has a very well-developed intelligence and special operations capabilities, so it does not surprise me that they would have this kind of capacity to do this, to target very precisely, just as they did in Beirut last weekend, that strike against the Hezbollah commander was very precise. It was very targeted. It was limited, and really done quite well, at least from a military standpoint. So I think the Israelis have extraordinary capabilities here, and certainly they're demonstrating it with these actions over the last several days.
So professional from a military standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, what do you make of the decision to kill basically the person who you're negotiating with for ceasefire talks on the Hamas side, especially in the context of the other attack in Beirut?
Well, I think as our president has said, it wasn't helpful. If your priority is trying to get your hostages home and to trying to end the conflict in Gaza, this was probably not the approach. What that tells me is that Israel is at a place where they prioritize punishing those who are responsible for these attacks and for the variety of attacks that have taken place on Israel over other matters that they have. And so I think that's what it tells us. It certainly wasn't helpful to the ceasefire negotiations.
Taken together, then, does that all point towards further escalation?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly we're in a cycle right now where the next steps are going to be military responses and escalation in some regards. I think both sides will attempt to operate in a way that is below kind of the accepted threshold that is in place now, which was really reestablished last April with exchange between the two countries. But yeah, the next set of responses and activities will be military. It doesn't mean that there's not opportunities for diplomacy and moving back into discussions, which is where this ultimately needs to go. This, like many conflicts, will not be resolved militarily.
I feel like we've been in similar positions several times during the course of this conflict where we've appeared to be on the brink of things perhaps escalating into a wider war, and everyone involved has kind of taken more rational steps back from the edge. Is there anything in your mind that makes you think this time might be different?
I don't know. I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, there's been a lot of twists and turns in this conflict, and each of these sides are acting in their own interests as they assess them and calculating their own risk for the things that they are doing. So I think it's really hard to project what's next. What I do think is I don't think either side, Iran and its network, or Israel, wants a long, protracted conflict, of conventional scale between both of these parties. That's not in anyone's interest. But yet they find themselves in a situation where they do have to respond. They do have to deal with the situations in which they're presented.
All right, General Joseph Votel, we have to leave it there. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
And up next, a Secret Service failure. New details from the acting Secret Service director about what happened and who's to blame for that assassination attempt on former President Trump. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The acting director of the Secret Service today is taking full responsibility for security failures surrounding the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. At a news conference this afternoon, acting director Ronald Rowe said that no state or local agency should be held responsible, that it was his agency's job to protect the former president.
The Secret Service takes full responsibility for the tragic events of July 13th. This was a mission failure. The sole responsibility of our agency is to make sure our protectees are never put in danger. We fell short of that in Butler, and I'm working to make sure that this failure does not happen again.
NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley joins me now. So, Julia, what, if anything, new did we learn from Rowe about the assassination attempt today?
I think this is the biggest thing people are going to be talking about after today's press conference is the fact that there were these crucial 30 seconds we've been talking about. We now know why this happened. These are the 30 seconds between when local police said over their radios, there's a gunman on the roof, and when the shots actually started being fired, which is how we know Secret Service realized there was someone there and eventually took him out. The reason they didn't didn't respond for those 30 seconds is because they weren't in the same command post. Not only were they not on the same radio frequencies, I said, weren't they together? You talk about this unified command center. He said, actually, there were 2 command centers. So local police were in one, talking over their radios, Secret Service and Pennsylvania State Police in another. And today I got the chance to talk to local law enforcement from cities like Chicago, elsewhere, people who have worked with Secret Service, and they say you always have people physically in the same location because the chances of radios going down are always high, and that's the way you get around that. So I think that's going to be a major takeaway as they start to dissect what went wrong on July 13th.
Build a bigger tent.
Yeah,
To everybody in the room. You are our immigration and border expert, so I want to switch gears a little bit, talk about the politics of the border. Donald Trump and his campaign have decided that this is the issue on which they want to target Kamala Harris and her record. You have done a deeper dive into what her record actually is on the border. What can you tell us?
Yeah, it was really interesting. We keep hearing about Kamala Harris being the border czar, but that's not really what she was assigned to do. She was asked to look at the root causes of immigration, specifically in Central America, and we were able to basically do a report card on that. What did she do? When did her action, public action, largely fall off? And what were the results? So here's what we learned. Since rising to the top of the ticket, Vice President Kamala Harris's handling of the border under renewed scrutiny and attack.
She was a border czar. She's done a horrible job.
But the White House and Harris campaign say border czar is an unfair label. The job Biden assigned her in March 2021 was to address the root causes of immigration in Central America.
Because we can chew gum and walk at the same time, must address the root causes that cause people to make the trek.
After that announcement, Harris visited Mexico and Guatemala. While in Mexico, Harris forged an agreement that has led the U.S. to commit $4 billion in direct assistance to Central America and over $5.2 billion in private investment in the region from U.S. companies. The White House says those investments are creating jobs and have connected more than 4.5 million people to the internet and brought more than 2.5 million people into the formal financial system. But in Guatemala, she garnered pushback from immigration advocates for telling migrants don't come to the U.S.
Do not come.
You had a message for would-be migrants. Don't come. Why should they believe you when they know that people are getting in?
The people who are here for generations, or if we know the history of Guatemala for centuries, they want to stay. They don't want to leave, but they need opportunity. They need assistance.
Also pressed by NBC's Lester Holt about why she hadn't visited the border, a criticism from Republicans.
So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe.
2 weeks later, Harris made a trip to El Paso, where she toured border facilities. After that trip, Harris's public-facing work on immigration largely fell off. She made one more Central American trip for the inauguration of Honduras's new president in 2022 and held 2 in-person meetings with the presidents of Mexico and Guatemala in D.C. Since Harris's work began, immigration from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras has fallen dramatically, from over 86,000 in March 2021 to just over 25,000 in June 2024. But some experts say Harris shouldn't get much credit for that. How much credit can Harris take for that decline from Central America?
I don't think that immigration has been one of her top priorities.
Andrew Seeley is the president of the nonpartisan think tank Migration Policy Institute.
I'm not sure how much Vice President Harris has been engaged in those discussions outside of the private sector part and some of the diplomatic work.
In the meantime, migration from other parts of the world, including Venezuela, China, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, are all on the rise. Harris's immigration record traces back to before she became VP. As California Attorney General, she regularly met with Latin American officials to fight organized crime. And as a senator in 2017, she led a group of Democratic lawmakers who threatened to withhold votes on a federal spending bill that did not include protections for DACA recipients. The nation's top Border Patrol union says some agents are unconvinced by Harris's record so far. What reaction does the name Kamala Harris evoke among Border Patrol agents?
It's not a good one. A lot of people roll their eyes. Nobody's seen any results from her efforts.
Meanwhile, on the campaign trail, Harris is defending her immigration record, pointing to her work combating transnational crime as California AG and the Biden administration's border security bill.
The border security bill that Donald Trump killed, and I will sign it into law. And
Julia Ainsley, NBC News, Washington.
So, Garrett, you know better than anyone that the Trump campaign is not going to stop beating up on Harris for her immigration record. But I did think it was interesting to look at how she did lead to billions of dollars of U.S. money investment in Central America. And by and large, those countries have seen a decrease, although the people we spoke to said that has more to do with policies that allow some of those people to apply for protections from their home countries and not be able to apply for asylum when they cross illegally.
Did your reporting give you a sense of how, if she's elected, she might address this issue? Would she take some of those same lessons to the other trouble spots you saw on the map, or would it be a more border-focused immigration policy to the degree that makes sense?
I think what's changed so much since 2021 when she got this assignment is that this style wouldn't really work anymore, because now we're getting migrants from all over the world. It's hard to imagine how you'd have that investment strategy in China, Venezuela, sub-Saharan Africa, and to have it have this same effect. So I think that's a real challenge for her going forward.
All right, Julia Ainsley, thank you for sharing your reporting and your expertise with us. This is good stuff. And still to come, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer meets the press, his view on the Trump-Vance ticket and what Democrats have to do to win the White House and Congress in November. That interview is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Amid this crazy, tumultuous, and historic stretch of political developments, my Capitol Hill colleague spoke to the top Democrat in the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. In the interview with NBC's Julie Sirkin and Scott Wong, Senator Schumer spoke about his view of the presidential race, including President Trump's recent comments questioning the vice president's racial identity.
Listen, every day, either Donald Trump or Vance makes some kind of crazy statement, and it's catching up with catching up to the American people. The more his poll numbers go down, the more Donald Trump is unhinged. And he's afraid to even debate Kamala Harris. He already said he wouldn't debate. You know, she's a strong black woman. Donald Trump may not want to say that, but it's true, and everyone knows it's true. He's afraid to debate her.
Julie Sirkin joins me now. So we hear the Majority Leader basically daring Donald Trump to debate. The kind of high road approach, though, with Trump obviously didn't work in 2016. Is Leader Schumer concerned that even considering that approach could spell disaster for Democrats this time around?
Well, I think, Garrett, Democrats are always walking this tightrope of, do they hit back against Trump and his attacks, or do they take that high road that you talked about? And that is exactly what I asked Leader Schumer. I pressed him on how exactly Democrats plan to respond this time around going into November, especially given his latest comments against Kamala Harris, against others in the party, even Schumer himself saying that the Majority Leader, the highest-ranking Jewish American official, is, quote, a member of Hamas. So these are things that I pressed Schumer directly on. He said that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. Listen to this.
Well, we have to respond in two ways. One, we have to we have to make it clear to the American people how ludicrous, how unhinged this group, the Trump-Vance ticket is, how there'll be total chaos in America if they get elected. But at the same time, the high road remains. We have to show the American people what we want to do for them in creating jobs, in saving democracy, in dealing with global warming, in dealing with student debt, and the kinds of things that people want us to do.
Now, it's a very different time, Garrett, but in 2020, it's that kind of messaging, that high road, that talking about issues and trying to be certain that American people understand what the former president is saying for what it is, that led them to victory, that led to some historic victories as well, including Schumer even having control of the Senate to begin with. So we'll see what they decide to do this time around, but certainly starting to call Trump weird and ludicrous and ridiculous shows you that they're not really only taking the high road after all.
Weird is so much kinder than threat to democracy on the sliding scale of insults, though. I want to ask you, I mean, you mentioned, the fact that he's the majority leader at all. That's not a job he might have for a lot longer based on this map. A lot of tough races for Senate Democrats for going into next year. What's your sense of what Schumer hopes to accomplish, between September when they come back and the end of this term, if that might be all the time he's going to get?
Well, the list is long. It starts with artificial intelligence putting guardrails around deepfakes when it comes to the election. He told me that this is something he needs Republican compromise on, or it'll get rolled into a must-pass bill if it does. He also wants to do some rail safety legislation that is bipartisan. He wants to move on some easing of marijuana banking restrictions. But there is a big difference, Garrett, as you and I well know, between what Schumer wants to do and hopes to do and what he actually can do, and that is because there's not a lot of time on the floor to actually get this stuff done. In the beginning of the Democratic control of the Senate a couple of years ago, he said that he would pass a ban on AR-15s and gun control legislation. You've pressed him on this over and over again as well, but with a two-seat majority, he just really can't get there. And again, all of this takes time. So presumably they'll do the national defense bill, they'll pass government funding, we'll see if they can roll any of this into it. But just so close to an election, it's really not likely that they'll get any of his wish list items done.
Julia, I got about 10 seconds left, but what's the vibe difference between now and 2 weeks ago on Capitol Hill among Senate Democrats?
Well, we tried to ask Schumer this question, right? Like, take a step back. This has been a pretty historic month, and he argued that now everyone is energized around Kamala Harris. He feels like they will keep the Senate. They'll pick up in the Senate in terms of the map. He didn't want to go really far in terms of his private conversations with Biden, but certainly two different realities between what Schumer thinks is going to happen and what McConnell thinks is going to happen in November.
Funny how that works out. All right, Julie Circa, my Capitol Hill team colleague, thank you for that reporting. And we're back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.